Students, in this video I'm going to talk about Southern reaction to Reconstruction. We see that during this period after the Civil War, that there is Southern resentment of Northern efforts to reconstruct the South. That this is seen by many Southerners as a foreign occupation of their states and of the soil. At the same time, there are many pre-slavery or from slavery racist attitudes towards African Americans within the South. And so we pick this up around 1868 with the election of Ulysses S. Grant, the leading Northern general from the Civil War, as president. And in Grant, we see someone who supported the Reconstruction consistently and effectively, but someone who was not an effective administrator in other regards, and whose government was weakened by corruption. And Grant celebrates the passing of the 15th Amendment, the amendment that gave all white and African American males in the United States the right to vote. But the passing of this amendment also creates a backlash against African American participation in the citizenship privileges, especially voting in the South. There's a lot of intimidation of African Americans voting. A number of African American voters are killed or injured trying to vote. This leads Grant to pass the Enforcement Acts, which sends the military into the South in order to enforce fair elections. But we also continue to see violence marring elections in the South. One of the most famous violent outbreaks that we see is known as the Colfax Massacre, in which white vigilantes assaulted and killed around 80 African Americans who were meeting in a church during the period of an election. And despite this horrific massacre, where we're told that people observing the scene after the massacre had been carried out saw nothing but black and colored bodies on the floor after the massacre had been carried out. Despite this, only 3 people are convicted for crimes that were carried out by this mob of vigilantes. We also see during this period the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, a movement that in northern southern states was designed more as a political machine to help get out the vote and encourage Democrats to win elections in the South. But in the Deep South, where you have larger African American populations, was very much aimed at suppressing African Americans voting for Republicans by using terrorist approaches. And so we see in which these are ways in which the program of civil rights and of Reconstruction is being hampered by this Southern backlash that is occurring during this period. The program of civil rights of the Reconstruction era is also hampered by several Supreme Court cases. And the most famous of these is the United States versus Cruikshank. And this case actually overturned the convictions of those who had been found guilty of carrying out the Colfax Massacre. Not that they weren't guilty of carrying out a horrific crime, but that the Supreme Court said that the prosecution of this type of crime could only be carried out in the states or by state governments, and that the federal government was overreaching its authority by carrying out these enforcement acts that Grant had passed, sending the military into the southern states when you're not in a period of war. And so again, here you see the 2 approaches to Reconstruction being laid out. On one side, the Supreme Court side, you have a sense that these Reconstruction programs, the federal government is becoming dangerously large, is overstepping its authority, is ruling over the states. And on the other hand, you have the radical Republicans who are arguing that if we leave this to the states, we're going to continue to see racism, we're going to continue to see terrorism carried out against African Americans, and therefore that the federal government has to step in to protect these rights. So again, we see this conflict of approaches to the post-war American South, and we see the ways in which efforts to establish civil rights during this period are halted or delayed in this region.